There are so many wonderful roles that nematodes and arthropods play that it's difficult to pick just one ecological aspect to focus on. I've picked parasites because the parasitic lifestyle is incredibly interesting, but I feel like I'm giving insects and roundworms a bad rap. So as we go through this mini lecture, please don't judge all nematodes and arthropods on the action of a few. Most are extremely valuable and important in ecosystems. Even the parasites can have really important roles. Speaking of giving groups of animals a bad name, insects were seen in a pretty negative light in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The housefly was the scourge of all insects at that time, mostly because growing cities did not have reliable or effective waste management systems. Garbage and animal feces piled up, and windows did not have screens yet. It was also the time when scientists realized that insects could spread disease. When chemical companies invented insecticides, people went crazy for them. Combine the explosive use of pesticides with increasing habitat destruction and climate change, and insect populations have been declining precipitously over the past 50 to 70 years. Most of the decline is in groups we don't like. Butterflies and dragonflies have been less impacted. Grasshoppers, beetles, and bees and wasps are more impacted. The problem is that all these groups are ecologically important. Beetles, for example, pollinate more flowers than bees. And crickets are a huge portion of the diet of fish like trout. Most species of trout are showing population declines. Researchers who studied insect species in habitats decades ago have recently revisited the same areas and recreated their research. Over and over again, all over the world, insect populations are collapsing. Here's one example. The red bars were from older studies. The blue bars were from the recreated recent studies. The last time the planet saw a mass extinction that included the loss of insects was 250 million years ago, during the Great Dying. Insects are incredibly important to human society and ecosystems in general. Insects make up about 65% of all animal species, so they're really important in food webs due to their sheer numbers. Of course, they're also important as pollinators. We use them in medical and genetic research and to inspire art. We domesticated the silkworm and use its cocoons to produce silk. Insects have been studied by engineers and designers to build search and rescue robots, strong new materials, and new types of architecture. We're starting to study them more and more to learn how to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. People, though, have been using insecticides to kill insects for about a century. But this attempt at control generally backfires for two reasons. First, any insects that have slight resistance to insecticides will survive and pass those genes on to their offspring. We end up creating more insect pests that cannot be killed by insecticides, so we have to spray more and more of the chemicals, and that's not good for any species, including humans. Second, if we spray for insects and kill them, what happens to bird populations that eat insects? They decline. But birds are more K-selected and insects are more R-selected. So if the insect's predators are gone, the remaining insect populations can explode. While we're seeing overall insect declines, we're also seeing more problems with insects we consider pests and more crop damage due to these animals. Let's look at parasites now, starting with nematodes. Remember how diverse nematodes are. Most are extremely important in soil ecosystems, but some are parasites. They're especially parasites of plants. Just about every plant or animal species has some nematode that parasitizes it. In humans, nematodes are the cause of many diseases, especially in tropical regions. Most industrialized countries like the US that devote funding to medical research tend to focus on diseases found here. So we neglect diseases located elsewhere, even if they're far more deadly. These are called neglected tropical diseases. We tend to think of diseases as being caused by bacteria or viruses, but most NTDs are caused by nematodes or flatworms in the phylum Platyhelminthes. Insects and mollusks are involved too because they serve as vectors that transport and transmit these parasites. While you may want to think of these animals as bad, please remember that some species can help humans or protect crops. There are far more insect and nematode species that are beneficial. There's even research into the health benefits of nematode infections. Industrialized countries have low rates of nematode parasites, but high rates of autoimmune diseases. One hypothesis is that since we evolved with nematode parasites, the loss of these animals means that our immune system is looking for something to fight, and it misdirects to fight our own bodies instead. As we start talking about parasites, let me explain medical student disease. It's the condition where medical students believe they have the diseases that they are studying. Some of you may hear about these parasites and think you have them, but please be aware that this is extremely unlikely. Okay, let's start with hookworms. These are nematodes that live inside the intestine. They use these attachment structures to latch on to the intestinal wall and feed on blood. They're common in areas with poor sanitation. Their life cycle requires them to move to the lungs before settling into the intestines. Many intestinal worms require this. What do the lungs and the intestines have in common? They both develop from endoderm. By the way, these are some of the intestinal parasites that are being investigated as a therapy for autoimmune diseases. Filarial worms are transmitted by flies and mosquitoes. Remember, mosquitoes are a type of fly. In the US, dog heartworm is the most common example of a filarial worm. If you've ever seen a bunch of flies on an animal's eye, some can transmit eyeworm. This woman is the first documented case of the evolution of cattle eyeworm into a human. And elephantiasis is caused by a nematode parasite that produces incredibly painful swelling of the limbs. The nematode is transmitted by a mosquito. Many parasites manipulate their hosts to ensure that they will be passed on. This nematode parasite invades an ant's body and turns its abdomen bright red. It also causes the ant host to lift its abdomen up, making it look like a berry. The nematode needs to enter a bird's intestine to complete its life cycle. This grasshopper's body is full of a Gordian worm, a close relative of nematodes. The worm triggers the grasshopper's brain to seek water. The insect jumps into the water and drowns, but the worm exits the body and moves on to its next life stage. Parasites manipulate us, too, to improve their odds of spreading and reproducing. Pinworms are generally harmless, but many little kids get them by playing in the dirt and putting their fingers in their mouths. The pinworms settle into the intestine, but the female moves to the anus at night to deposit her eggs. The process causes intense itching, which transfers eggs to the kid's fingers, and again, if the hands are not washed, the eggs can be passed to other surfaces and other people. The itching causes a behavior that improves the success of the parasite. Kristen Bell recently had an incident of pinworms in her home and went on talk shows to express horror and disgust at these parasites. But this infection is easily treated and rarely harmful. There are truly terrible parasites that are far more important for us to focus on. One is the guinea worm, which we saw in the last mini lecture. They enter a human through water and must get back to water to complete their life cycle. They do this by moving to a person's leg and causing a painful burning sensation. To relieve this burning, the person puts their foot in water to cool it, and the worm happily releases her offspring into the water, completing the life cycle. There are many insect parasites as well, or insects that transport diseases as vectors. This is the emerald cockroach wasp that uses its stinger to stab the brain of the cockroach. Not just the brain. Her stinger has sensory components that can locate a specific part of the brain. The sting keeps the cockroach alive, but eliminates its desire to get away. The wasp leads the cockroach by its antennae back to her nest, where she deposits an egg on the cockroach and seals up the nest. The egg hatches and the larval wasp devours the cockroach from the inside out. This fly lays her egg in the head of an ant. The developing larva manipulates its host toward a moist, dark habitat. Then the larva gets so large that it pops the ant's head off and emerges in the perfect habitat. This is a crustacean parasite that replaces the tongue of a fish. While it's pretty horrifying to see, it doesn't seem to harm the fish much. There are also molluscan parasites and even some rotifer parasites. Parasitism is an extremely successful way of life. A recent study showed that it evolved independently 223 times and is found in 15 phyla of animals. While you might find parasitism a little distasteful, I hope you have a bit more appreciation for the fascinating life cycles and the evolutionary fitness of this way of life.